Margaret Blake had never considered herself a superstitious person, nor was she prone to paranoia. She was a pragmatist through and through, a woman who believed in facts, contracts, and the weight of the law. At 38, she had built her life on structure, on a career that demanded logic and precision. She had spent the past 12 years working as a corporate attorney, drafting airtight contracts and closing multi-million-dollar deals for powerful clients who rarely saw her as more than a necessary obstacle. It was a profession that required an impenetrable shell, a steady hand, and an unwillingness to be swayed by emotions. This same mentality carried over into her personal life. When she finally decided to stop renting and buy a home of her own, she approached it with the same diligence she applied to her work. She researched, vetted, and scrutinized every detail, ensuring that the house she purchased was not just a dream but a solid, legally sound investment. The house was everything she had wanted. A beautiful two-story property in a quiet, well-established neighborhood, far enough from the city to offer peace but close enough to remain connected. It was the kind of home she had imagined herself owning for years. Wide windows that let in golden afternoon light, polished hardwood floors that creaked slightly underfoot, a kitchen with marble countertops where she could cook elaborate meals she would likely eat alone. She had never been one to romanticize domestic life, but for the first time she allowed herself to feel the weight of what this home represented: stability, permanence, a place that was hers and hers alone. The closing process had been exhaustive, but Margot had left no room for error. Every document had been reviewed, every signature cross-checked. The property had been legally transferred to her, the deed in her name, the records updated in City Hall. There was no doubt, no loophole, no lingering attachment to the previous owner. Or so she had thought. The first time she noticed something odd, she dismissed it. It was late, her second night in the house, and she had been unpacking for hours, attempting to bring order to the chaos of stacked boxes and misplaced belongings. Exhausted, she made herself a cup of tea and wandered through the quiet house, feeling the strangeness of being in a new space, of claiming something that had once belonged to someone else. It wasn't until she reached the kitchen that she saw it. A coffee cup sat on the counter, dark stains dried at the bottom, not hers. She hadn't made coffee yet, hadn't even unpacked her coffee maker. A trick of the mind, she told herself. Maybe she had overlooked it during the initial walkthrough, a forgotten remnant of the previous owner. Still, it unsettled her, a small whisper of something out of place. She washed the cup, set it aside, and told herself not to think about it. The second incident was harder to ignore. She had taken a break from unpacking to step outside, enjoying the crisp autumn air as she stood on her front porch with a glass of wine. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with tall oaks that shed golden leaves across the pavement. It was peaceful in a way she wasn't used to, after years of living in the constant hum of the city. As she turned to go back inside, she hesitated. The front door was ajar. Margot froze. She had closed it. She was sure of it. Slowly she pushed it open wider, scanning the dimly lit interior. Nothing seemed disturbed, but a tight knot of unease settled in her stomach. She locked the door, double-checked the windows, and convinced herself it was nothing a faulty latch, a gust of wind. Then came the letter. It arrived 3 days later, tucked neatly among the usual stack of bills and junk mail. The envelope was thick, the paper high quality, the kind used for formal legal correspondence. Her name was printed in bold letters on the front, but the sender's address was unfamiliar. Margot opened it without thinking, her lawyer's instincts kicking in as her eyes skimmed the text. It was a formal notice, a demand for eviction. She read it twice, then a third time, her pulse pounding louder with each word. The letter claimed that the sale of the property had been illegitimate, that a clerical error had mistakenly transferred ownership when, in fact, the previous owner had never legally relinquished the deed. It stated that she was trespassing on the property and would need to vacate within 7 days or face legal consequences. Bullshit. Margot's grip on the letter tightened. She knew the law, knew the real estate process inside and out. There was no error, no loophole that could make this claim valid. The house was hers. The sale had been conducted legally, processed by a reputable firm, signed off by every necessary authority. There was no chance of a mistake. And yet, someone had gone through the trouble of drafting this letter, of presenting it as if it held any legal weight. Someone wanted her gone. She scanned the sender's information. Jonathan Malone. The name wasn't familiar, but a quick search through her documents confirmed what she suspected: he was the previous owner. The man who had sold the house. A sale he had agreed to, a contract he had signed. And now he was trying to undo it? No, it wasn't going to happen. Marga didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed her lawyer, her mind already racing through the necessary steps to shut this down before it escalated. But as she waited for the call to connect, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that this wasn't just a desperate attempt to reclaim the house. It felt calculated, methodical. And she had a sinking suspicion that Jonathan Malone wasn't finished yet. Margot wasn't the type to panic, but the letter left her with a cold sense of unease that settled deep in her stomach. She had seen attempts like this before: frivolous lawsuits, baseless claims meant to intimidate or stall legal proceedings, but they were almost always used in high-stakes corporate battles, not personal real estate disputes. The language in the notice was carefully worded, designed to sound official, but she knew enough to recognize the flaws. If Jonathan Malone had any legal grounds to contest the sale, it would have been done before the closing, not weeks after she had already taken possession. This wasn't a real lawsuit, it was a tactic, but for what purpose? She wasted no time scanning the document, searching for inconsistencies. The date on the letterhead was from 2 days ago, meaning Malone had sent this after she had moved in. The signature at the bottom was printed, not handwritten, and the address listed as the sender's was not the one she had for him in the sale records. Her first instinct was that he had hired a cheap lawyer to try and scare her into leaving, but the absence of an official law firm's name stood out. It was just his name, printed boldly, as if that alone should be enough to convince her to pack her bags and disappear. She set the letter down and exhaled slowly. This was a bluff, and she had no intention of falling for it. Grabbing her phone, she dialed her attorney, Chris Langford, a man she had trusted with contract negotiations for years. He picked up after 3 rings, his voice steady and efficient, as always. She explained the situation, keeping her tone measured, outlining every detail of the letter without letting emotion seep into her words. When she finished, there was a pause on the other end before Chris finally sighed. "Well, he's bold, I'll give him that," he said, the faintest trace of irritation in his tone. "This isn't legitimate, Margot. If there were an actual claim to the property, it would have gone through the courts before you ever signed the deed. And even if there was a clerical error, which, let's be clear, is highly unlikely, this isn't how it would be handled. He can't just send you a letter and tell you to leave. That's not how the law works." "I figured as much," she said, pacing the length of her kitchen. "But I don't like the timing. If this were just about money, he would have tried to renegotiate before closing. This feels personal." Chris hummed in agreement. "Could be. I'll pull any recent filings under his name, see if he's attempted anything formal. But I'll be honest, Margot, guys like this usually don't go through the proper channels. If he's trying to intimidate you, he's going to escalate when he realizes you're not taking the bait." She already knew that, and yet hearing it spoken aloud made her grip the phone just a little tighter. "What's my next move?" she asked. "Formally document everything. Scan the letter, save copies, and send one to me. If anything else shows up, strange notices, unexpected bills, anything, keep a record. And whatever you do, don't respond to him directly. The moment you acknowledge this, he'll think you're engaging. And that's what he wants." Margot nodded to herself, already walking toward her office to fire up her scanner. "Got it. Keep me updated." "Of course." And Margot. Chris hesitated for the briefest second before continuing, his voice slightly lower. "Lock your doors." She hung up without responding. The doors had already been locked since the first night she moved in. The next morning she found something that made her reconsider just how far Malone was willing to go. It was early, the sun barely rising over the trees, when she stepped outside to grab the newspaper from the driveway. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth lingering from the rain the night before. As she bent down to pick up the paper, something caught her eye, a small, neatly folded piece of paper tucked into the corner of her porch railing. It hadn't been there last night. She unfolded it carefully, her pulse steady but her stomach twisting in anticipation. "I know you've seen my letter. I suggest you start packing." No name, no signature, just that single sentence, written in clean, precise handwriting. Margaret clenched her jaw. She turned, scanning the quiet street, looking for any sign that someone might be watching. But the neighborhood was still, the houses dark, no movement beyond the occasional rustling of leaves. Someone had walked up to her porch in the middle of the night and left this note. That wasn't just intimidation. That was a warning. By the time she got back inside, her fingers were shaking not from fear but from anger. Enough. If Jonathan Malone wanted a fight, she would give him one. She spent the next few hours making calls, pulling every record she could find on Malone. His name wasn't attached to any recent lawsuits, no pending claims on the house, no signs of legal action. But there was something odd. He still owned 2 other properties in the city, one of which was less than 10 minutes away. If he wasn't trying to reclaim the house out of desperation, then what the hell was his real motive? She was still turning over the possibilities when the doorbell rang. Her breath hitched slightly before she reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. She squared her shoulders, walked to the door, and pulled it open. A man stood on her porch. Not Malone. Someone younger, mid-30s, dressed in business casual but with a subtle air of calculation. "MS. Blake," he asked smoothly. She didn't answer. The man gave a small, polite smile. "Apologies for the unannounced visit. My name is Richard Calloway. I represent a group of investors with interest in this neighborhood. We've been looking at properties in the area, and I was wondering if you'd be open to discussing an offer on your home." Her grip on the doorknob tightened. An offer. On a home she had just purchased. She had barely been here a week, and someone was already trying to buy her out. The timing wasn't a coincidence. She folded her arms, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm not interested." Calloway didn't falter. "I understand that, MS Blake, but I assure you our investors are prepared to offer well above market value. We believe this area is due for major redevelopment in the coming years, and we'd like to acquire key properties before that happens. If you're willing to hear our offer, I think you'll find it very generous." The way he said it sent a sharp pulse of irritation through her spine. This wasn't a casual real estate inquiry. This was a test. She held his gaze for a moment before finally speaking. "Tell your investors they're wasting their time. The house isn't for sale." The polite smile never wavered, but there was something cold behind his eyes. "Of course. I appreciate your time." He handed her his card, turned, and walked back to his car. Margaret stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about Malone. This was something bigger. And they thought she would fold. They were wrong. Margaret had spent her entire career navigating high-stakes negotiations, dissecting legal jargon, and countering aggressive corporate tactics designed to corner the weak and uninformed. But this wasn't some executive contract dispute or a breach of confidentiality lawsuit. This was her home, and someone was trying to rip it out from under her using threats, intimidation, and legal maneuvering that, on the surface, seemed sloppy, but Margaret had a gut feeling that this was far more organized than it appeared. Jonathan Malone's letter had been just the first move, an attempt to test how easily she could be shaken. The note on her porch had been the second, a more personal reminder that whoever was behind this wasn't just some desperate man clinging to a lost property. And now an unannounced visit from a corporate representative making an unsolicited offer on a home she had barely finished unpacking into. It was a sequence of events too deliberate to be coincidental. Malone wasn't acting alone. He was a piece on someone else's chessboard, a familiar tactic she had seen before in hostile takeovers: isolate the target, apply pressure from multiple angles, make them doubt their position, then offer them an out. They expected her to break, to take the easy way out and walk away with a generous settlement before things became truly difficult. They didn't know who they were dealing with. That night, Margaret went through every document related to the sale of the house, cross-checking it with the city's property records. Everything was airtight. No discrepancies. No evidence of clerical errors. No pending claims or liens before she purchased it. Yet something about this didn't feel like just another scam. It was too pointed, too specific. They had targeted her. But why? At 3:17 a.m., her phone vibrated on the nightstand. The sharp noise cut through the heavy silence, jerking her out of the haze of exhaustion that had settled over her. She reached for it instinctively, blinking against the glow of the screen. An unknown caller. She let it ring out. No voicemail. A minute later, another vibration. Blocked number. Still, she ignored it. The third call came through at 3:22 a.m. This time she answered. Silence. Not static, not heavy breathing, just absolute, deliberate silence, as if someone was holding the phone close, listening, waiting for her to speak first. She didn't. Instead, she reached for her laptop with her free hand and opened the tracing software she had installed years ago when dealing with more discreet corporate cases. She wasn't naive enough to believe she could trace a blocked call directly, but there were always digital footprints, small breadcrumbs that careless people left behind. After 30 seconds of silence, the caller finally ended the call. Margot didn't go back to sleep. The following morning, she received an email from Chris. The subject line read, Malone, no court filings, but possible issues. She skimmed through his message quickly. No official legal actions had been taken against her ownership. However, there was an irregularity in Malone's financial records. The man had received a substantial payout 2 weeks before selling the house, but the source of the transaction was buried under multiple shell accounts. Chris had flagged it as suspicious, considering Malone was now claiming to have been wrongfully forced out of his home. If he had been paid before selling, then why was he suddenly so desperate to take it back? It wasn't about regret. It wasn't even about money. It was something else entirely. Margot left her house just after noon, locking the doors behind her with a measured deliberation. She had always considered herself aware, cautious without being paranoid, but the moment she stepped off her porch, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Not an obvious presence, not a car idling across the street, or a shadow shifting behind drawn curtains, but something subtle, like the air itself had grown heavier. She drove straight to the city archives, requesting every available record on her house dating back as far as they had on file. It took nearly 2 hours of waiting, but when the clerk finally returned with a stack of documents and old survey maps, the first thing Margot noticed was an old deed transfer that had been sealed for over 2 decades. Property transfers weren't supposed to be sealed. Not unless there was a legal reason. She took out her phone and snapped pictures of everything, scanning through the names attached to previous ownership records. The property had changed hands multiple times, often under unusual circumstances. One name caught her attention, Alan Harrington, listed as the owner in 1998, but there was no record of him selling. Instead, the next listed owner was a private trust, which later transferred the property to Malone. Alan Harrington had never sold the house. His ownership had simply stopped existing on the official records. Margot's hands clenched into fists as she stared at the paperwork, a sense of unease twisting into something sharper, colder. She had spent years handling legal disputes, unraveling fraud schemes, navigating the cracks in corporate law where people hid their dirtiest secrets. She knew exactly what this meant. Someone had been stealing properties. Not in the traditional sense, not through simple forged deeds or fake sales, but through a ray erasure, wiping out prior claims, manipulating records so that the rightful owners simply disappeared from the system. Her house was part of a pattern. The weight of that realization settled over her like ice water down her spine. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a playbook, one that had been used before, likely more than once, and whoever had orchestrated it wasn't going to let her stand in the way of whatever plan they had for the property. As she left the archives, Margot's mind was already moving ahead to the next step. She needed leverage, something solid that she could use to force whoever was behind this into the open. Malone was just a pawn, a middleman, who had been paid off to facilitate whatever was really happening. The real question was who was calling the shots. She didn't get her answer until she pulled into her driveway and saw that someone had left a single key on her front porch. It wasn't hers. It didn't match any of the locks in the house. Attached to it was a note, written in the same careful handwriting as the one she had found days ago. You shouldn't have started digging. Last warning. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, the tight coil of anger in her chest unfurling into something sharper, more focused. They had been trying to intimidate her, hoping she would back down, but now they had made a mistake. They had acknowledged what she was doing, and that meant they were afraid. Margot had spent her life dismantling men like this. Corporate sharks who thought they were untouchable, corrupt executives who hid behind layers of bureaucracy and technicalities, real estate developers who buried their fraud under mountains of legal paperwork. She had ruined people for less. She picked up the key, turned it over in her hand, then pocketed it. If they wanted a fight, she was ready to give them one. Margaret sat at her desk, staring at the key she had found on her porch. The smooth metal was cold against her fingertips, the small tag attached to it blank, no indication of what lock it was meant to open. Whoever had left it there had wanted her to find it. They wanted her to know they were watching, but more than that, it was a message. A warning. And she had spent too many years dealing with men who mistook intimidation for power to let this rattle her. She was done being passive, done waiting for the next move to come to her doorstep. It was time to shift the balance. She picked up her phone and dialed Chris. I need to find out what happened to Alan Harrington, she said as soon as he answered. His name was on the property records before Malone, but there's no record of him ever selling the house. It just disappeared into a private trust. Chris exhaled sharply. That's not normal. No, it's not. And I don't think Malone is the one running this game. He's just a piece of it, she hesitated, glancing at the key again. Someone left something for me last night. A key. No explanation, no note, just this. Chris was silent for a moment. That's a move straight out of the playbook, Margot. Give the target a reason to second-guess their own security. Make them feel like they're already losing before the real attack even begins. I'm not interested in playing their game, she said, pressing her fingers against her temple, trying to quell the frustration that had been building since this whole mess began. I need to find Harrington. I'll start digging, Chris said. If there's anything to find, I'll get it. She thanked him and hung up, but she wasn't content to sit back and wait. She needed to get out of the house, clear her head, look at this from a different angle. She grabbed her coat, slipping the key into her pocket, and headed out the door. The archives had given her one undeniable truth: this property had history, and it wasn't the kind that was meant to be uncovered. If she wanted answers, she needed to start at the source, and that meant tracking down the people who had lived here before her. She spent the next few hours driving through the neighborhood, stopping at the houses closest to hers. It was an older community, filled with residents who had lived there for decades. The first two doors she knocked on yielded nothing. The third was answered by an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a posture that spoke of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to be underestimated. Alan Harrington, Margaret said, holding out a picture she had pulled from the archives. Did you know him? The woman didn't speak for a long moment, her eyes flicking between Margot and the photo. Then, finally, she nodded. He was a good man, she said. A little paranoid, maybe, but with good reason. What kind of reason? The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be listening. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in. Margot followed her inside, the air thick with the scent of old books and faint traces of cinnamon. I take it you're the new owner of that house, the woman said as she led her into the living room. Margot nodded. The woman sat down with a sigh. Alan was my neighbor for over 15 years, she said. He lived in that house longer than anyone. Took care of it like it was the only thing in the world that mattered to him. Then, one day, he was just gone. Margot frowned. Gone. The woman nodded. Disappeared. No warning, no moving trucks. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. People asked questions, but there were no answers. The city record said he sold the house, but no one ever saw the sale happen. A few months later, Malone moved in. Margot's stomach twisted. Did anyone try to find him? Oh, plenty of people tried, the woman said, shaking her head. But it was like he never existed, no forwarding address, no contact information, just gone. Margot sat back, gripping the arms of the chair. This was bigger than she had thought. If Alan Harrington hadn't left, if he had been erased, then what did that mean for her? Before she left, the woman handed her an old envelope, yellowed with age. He left this in my mailbox the day before he disappeared, she said. I never understood what it meant. Maybe you will. Margot took the envelope and stepped outside, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. She climbed into her car, took a deep breath, and tore it open. Inside was a single key, identical to the one left on her porch. She stared at it, her pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't just intimidation. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was a message from the past. She drove straight to Chris's office, her mind racing through the implications. Chris took one look at her expression and didn't bother with pleasantries. What happened? She dropped the two identical keys on his desk. Alan Harrington left that one for his neighbor the day before he vanished. Chris's jaw tightened. And the other, someone left it on my porch last night. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. That's not a coincidence. No, Margot said, her voice steady. It's not. Chris ran a hand through his hair, his mind clearly working through the same possibilities hers was. If Harrington didn't disappear willingly, then someone made him disappear. And if someone left this key for you now, it means they know you're getting close to something. Margot met his gaze. Or they want me to think I am. Chris nodded slowly. Either way, they're trying to control the narrative. The question is why. Margot already had a theory. She pulled out the copies of the old property records, pointing to the sealed transfer. This house was never supposed to be sold, Chris. It was taken. Malone was just a placeholder, a way to keep it moving until they were ready for whatever comes next. But I don't think it's just about the property itself. I think it's about whoever gets in their way. Chris tapped his fingers against the desk, considering. Which means you're next. Margot clenched her jaw. They've already started. Chris exhaled sharply. All right, then we do this right. No reacting. No letting them control the pace. Margot nodded. She was done reacting. It was time to take control. She reached into her pocket, fingers closing around the key. If this was the next move in their game, she was ready to play. Margot stood at her kitchen table, staring at the contract left for her in the middle of the night. The paper felt thick between her fingers, the wax seal already broken, the words staring back at her like a quiet ultimatum. There was nothing official about it, no legal letterhead, no identification of who had sent it. Just a direct and absolute demand: sell the house, take the money, leave and forget. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a threat. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that she had already lost, that no matter how much she fought, the outcome had already been decided. This was what they had been working toward from the moment she moved in, step by step, increasing the pressure, waiting for her to reach the moment where she would break. But they had miscalculated. She had spent her entire career fighting against men who mistook leverage for power, who believed that intimidation was the same thing as control. They had chosen the wrong person to corner, and now they had made a mistake. They had shown her their hand, and she wasn't going to let them pull it back. She picked up her phone and called Chris, waiting as the line rang. When he finally answered, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She told him about the break-in, the contract, every detail down to the exact wording. When she finished, there was silence on the other end, just the sound of Chris breathing, processing what she had told him. She could picture him at his desk, leaning back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he worked through the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, but there was an edge of something she didn't like. This isn't just property fraud anymore, this is organized. You're not dealing with a single person, you're dealing with a group. She already knew that, had known it for days, but hearing it confirmed out loud settled something deeper inside her. It wasn't paranoia, it wasn't an overreaction, it was real, and now she needed to decide what she was going to do about it. Chris told her to get out of the house, to leave for the night, stay somewhere safe, not take the risk of being alone in a place they had already proven they could access. But Margot wasn't leaving. She wasn't going to give them what they wanted, wasn't going to let them dictate the terms of this fight. If she left now, she would never come back. That was the game, that was the plan, to keep applying pressure until the choice seemed like her own, until she walked away willingly so they didn't have to force her. But she had spent too many years breaking apart hostile takeovers to fall for this strategy, and she wasn't about to let herself become one more name erased from the records of this house. She told Chris she was staying, and he sighed, but he didn't argue. If you're not going to leave, then we need to force them to make a mistake. You don't react, you set the terms. Make them think you have something they don't want exposed. Margot understood immediately. The house was the key to whatever was happening here, but it wasn't just the property that mattered, it was what had been buried beneath it, the history that had been rewritten again and again until there was no one left to question it. If she had uncovered this much in just a matter of weeks, then what would happen if she kept going? If she stopped being on the defensive and started pushing forward? She spent the next morning filing an official fraud complaint with the city, attaching every suspicious document she had uncovered about the property's past ownership, every record that had been altered, every name that had vanished. She had no illusions that this would stop whoever was behind it, but it would create a paper trail, something permanent, a mark that couldn't be erased as easily as a person. If anything happened to her, there would be records. It was a warning shot, subtle but deliberate, letting them know that she wasn't going to disappear quietly. Then she did something that she knew would provoke them. She changed the locks again, but this time she installed security cameras. Not hidden ones, not discreet, but obvious, positioned at every entrance, visible to anyone who stepped onto the property. It was a statement, a challenge, a way of making it clear that if they were going to keep playing their game, she was going to start keeping score. The first retaliation came that night. The cameras caught movement in the early hours of the morning. A single figure, hooded, moving through the yard, staying in the shadows, careful, deliberate. But he wasn't breaking in. He wasn't breaking in. He wasn't trying to enter the house. He was leaving something behind. In the morning, Margot found a single photograph pinned to her door. The edges were slightly curled, the ink faded, but the image was clear. Alan Harrington, the man who had owned the house before Malone, the man who had disappeared without a trace, staring directly into the camera. Across the bottom of the image, written in thick black ink, were 3 words. He never left. Margot stared at the photo, her breath slow, even, her pulse steady. They weren't just trying to push her out anymore. They were telling her exactly what happened to the last person who had lived here. This wasn't about ownership. This wasn't about money. This was about erasure. They hadn't just stolen houses. They had stolen people. Margot stood at her kitchen table, the photograph of Alan Harrington still in her hand, the inked words staring back at her like a message from the grave. He never left. The weight of it settled in her chest, the final confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect but hadn't wanted to fully admit. This was never about a simple property dispute or a clerical error in the records. It wasn't even about Jonathan Malone trying to reclaim a home he had willingly sold. This was something deeper, something that had been happening for years, buried under layers of false ownership transfers and sealed documents. Alan Harrington hadn't disappeared because he had chosen to. He had been removed, just like they were trying to remove her. The difference was, they had done it before without leaving a trace. And this time they had made the mistake of trying it on someone who knew how to fight back. She knew they were watching her, waiting to see how she would react. If she showed fear, if she stopped pushing forward, if she made even the smallest move to pack up and leave, they would know they had won. But she wasn't going anywhere. She had already started the process of exposing them, already put enough legal markers in place that if anything happened to her now, it wouldn't just disappear into bureaucratic silence. They had spent years perfecting this strategy, eliminating people who got in their way, rewriting property records as if the previous owners had never existed. But now, for the first time, someone was resisting. She picked up her phone and called Chris, barely waiting for him to speak before saying, "They left something for me again." Chris didn't even sound surprised anymore. "What is it this time?" She told him about the photograph, about the message written across the bottom, about the implications that Alan Harrington had never truly left the house. There was silence on the other end, a long pause before Chris finally exhaled and said, "Margot, you need to stop sleeping there. This is escalating." "I know," she said, gripping the edge of the table, grounding herself. "But if I leave, they win." "They aren't playing by rules," Chris said, his voice tight with something close to frustration. "You're thinking like a lawyer, and they aren't operating in a courtroom. They've done this before, and they've gotten away with it every time. The only reason you're still standing is because they don't know what you have on them yet. But if they decide you're too much of a problem—" "I want to meet Malone," she interrupted, the thought forming even as she said it out loud. Chris hesitated. "That's a bad idea." "He knows something," she pressed. "He's not the mastermind, but he was involved enough to understand how this works. He took money to play along, and now he's trying to take the house back. I need to know why." Chris sighed, but he didn't argue. "I'll set it up." It took less than a day for Malone to agree to the meeting, which only confirmed what Margot had suspected. He wasn't just some desperate former homeowner trying to reclaim lost property. He wanted to talk. He needed to. Which meant he was running out of options just as fast as she was. They met at a neutral location, a rundown diner just outside the city, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions. Malone was already there when she arrived, sitting in a booth near the back, his eyes darting toward the door like a man who expected trouble at any moment. He looked worse than he had in the photos she had seen, older, more worn down, like whatever he had been running from had finally caught up to him. She slid into the booth across from him, setting her hands flat on the table, keeping her voice even. "Why did you try to take the house back?" Malone didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, studying her face like he was trying to decide how much she already knew. Then, finally, he exhaled and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Because I knew they wouldn't let you keep it." Margot held his gaze. "Who are they?" Malone shook his head. "I don't know names. I never did. That's how they work. You don't ask questions, you don't get answers, and you don't make trouble. You sign the papers, take the money, and walk away." "But you came back," she said. His jaw tightened. "Because they were supposed to let me go. That was the deal. You sell when they tell you to sell, you move when they tell you to move, and they leave you alone. But it never really ends. They keep you on a leash just in case they need you again." Margot's fingers curled slightly against the table. "Alan Harrington." Malone's face darkened. "I didn't know him. Not really. But I knew what happened to him. He fought them. He didn't take the deal." The meaning was clear. Alan hadn't left. He had refused to comply, and they had made him disappear. Margot leaned in. "Where is he?" Malone shook his head again. "I don't know. No one does." He swallowed hard, looking away. "But I know what they told me when I signed the sale. They said the house wasn't mine to sell, that it belonged to them." The word sent an icy chill through her veins, the final confirmation that this wasn't about money, wasn't about real estate. This was ownership in the absolute sense. Not just of property, but of people, of history, of anyone who got in their way. She didn't press him further. She knew when a man had told her everything he was capable of saying. If he knew more, he wasn't willing to risk it. She left the diner without looking back. By the time she got home, the house felt different. Not because of anything tangible, not because of any sign of intrusion, but because she now understood exactly what it meant to be living here. This wasn't just her home. It was a graveyard of people who had tried and failed to hold on to it before her. The only question left was whether she would be the next name on that list. She wasn't planning on giving them the chance. Margot sat in her car outside the house, gripping the steering wheel with fingers that had long since gone numb from the tension running through her body. She had spent the last few hours replaying her conversation with Malone, every word, every pause, every unspoken implication buried between the lines. This house had never been his to sell, just like it had never truly belonged to Alan Harrington before him. It belonged to them, whoever they were, and every person who had tried to claim it had been erased. She was the first to fight back, the first to drag their scheme into the light, but she was under no illusion that exposing them meant she had already won. If anything, she had just escalated the game into its most dangerous phase. She forced herself to breathe, slow and controlled, before stepping out of the car and walking up the driveway. The house loomed in front of her, silent, waiting. She had spent weeks inside these walls, believing she was alone, but now she knew better. She had always been watched. She had always been expected to break. But instead of running, instead of giving them what they wanted, she had done something none of their previous victims had. She had started digging. And now she was going to finish it. The lock clicked open under her hand, but before she even stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The air was different. The silence too complete. It was the kind of stillness that came when a space had been altered, when something was waiting to be discovered. She closed the door behind her, standing in the entryway for a long moment before she moved forward. The house looked untouched at first glance. No broken windows, no overturned furniture, no obvious sign of intrusion. But as she walked toward the kitchen, she saw it. A single folder placed neatly on the counter. Not hers. Not something she had left there. She swallowed hard and stepped closer, flipping it open with careful fingers. Inside were documents. Real ones. The first page was a death certificate. Alan Harrington's name printed in clean, official lettering. Cause of death missing, presumed deceased. The date was over 15 years ago. But that wasn't the worst part. The next document was a property deed, not for her house. For multiple houses, all within the same radius, all connected through a web of trusts and shell corporations designed to mask the real owners. But now that she was looking at them all in one place, the pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't about her. It wasn't even just about this house. It was a system. A network of properties that had been taken, erased, reassigned, over and over again, with no trace of the people who had lived in them before. Alan Harrington wasn't the first. He had just been one of many. Margaret exhaled slowly, her hands tightening around the edges of the folder as she processed what she was looking at. Whoever had left this here wanted her to see it, but more importantly, they wanted her to understand. They weren't just telling her to leave anymore. They were making it clear what would happen if she didn't. She closed the folder and set it back down, her pulse steady. Fear was a tool, a weapon they had used time and time again to force people out, to make them disappear without a fight. But fear only worked when it was one-sided, and Margot wasn't afraid anymore. She picked up her phone and called Chris. They were inside again, she said as soon as he answered. Chris cursed under his breath. What did they do? They left proof, she said. Not just about this house. About all of them. Silence stretched across the line before Chris finally spoke. Margot, you need to listen to me. You need to get out of there. No, she said. I need to end this. Chris exhaled sharply. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Margot glanced back at the folder. I'm going to make it impossible for them to keep doing this. They've spent years burying this, covering their tracks, making sure no one ever connects the dots. But now I have the one thing they never planned for. And what's that? Leverage. Chris was silent for a long moment before he sighed. You're not going to let this go, are you? Would you? Of course not, he muttered. All right, tell me what you need. Margot spent the next 24 hours preparing, locking down every piece of information she had gathered, making copies, sending them to people she trusted, ensuring that if anything happened to her, the truth wouldn't die with her. She wanted them to know that. She needed them to understand that if they touched her, they wouldn't just lose this one house. They would lose everything. By the time night fell, she was ready. She sat in the living room, lights dimmed, waiting. She knew they would come. She had given them no choice. They couldn't afford to let her keep what she had found, and they couldn't afford to let her walk away with it either. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, counting down the seconds until the inevitable. And then, just past midnight, she heard it. The sound of a car pulling up outside. Footsteps. Margot's fingers tightened around the phone in her lap, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button, but she didn't press it. Not yet. She let them get close. Let them reach the porch. Let them believe that she was exactly where they needed her to be. And then, just as the door handle turned, she spoke, loud enough for them to hear through the walls. "You're too late." Silence. Then movement. Fast. Someone retreating, realizing that they had walked into something they hadn't anticipated. Margot smiled. She had already won. By the time she called Chris the next morning, the evidence had been delivered to every necessary office. Fraud investigators, real estate regulators, even a few journalists who wouldn't be able to resist a story like this. The system that had protected these people for so long was about to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. And Margot? She was still standing. She stepped out onto her porch, breathing in the cool morning air, feeling the house settle around her, no longer a battleground but something stronger, something earned. This house was hers, and no one was ever taking it away again,